Welcome, wonderful people, and thank you for joining us on this week's topic, which is narcissism and how to identify somebody as narcissistic, what are the key characteristics, and what that impact might be on you. So we give you some tips about that. So I'm joined today with Tim Rice, my husband and relationship counsellor, and we're going to chat about narcissism and see if we can give you some tips about how to deal with this really difficult issue. Hello, my name is Helen Garlick. For 35 years, I was a family lawyer and mediator, but I kept secret what was happening in my own family of origin. Now I know it's time to talk about it. So I'd like to warmly welcome you to Hello, It's Better to Talk. So in my book, No Place to Lie, I name my mother as narcissistic. And that was a word that I was kind of umming and ahhing about whether or not to use it. Self-absorbed is an easier word to hear. And we hear a lot nowadays about narcissism and narcissists, don't we? Mm-hmm. Although the kind of whole concept has been around for a really long time. The Greek myth of Narcissus, who was a beautiful young man who fell in love with his reflection in a pool. We've got a picture behind. Yeah. And then how Echo fell in love with Narcissus. And Narcissus was so self-absorbed that all he was really interested in was himself. And Echo kind of hung around and was able to hang around, but only if she could echo back to Narcissus what he was saying about himself. So I suppose that's that's what narcissists often need, is somebody around them who will agree with what they say. Mm-hmm. Do you want to just chat a bit about key happily. Traits?
Yes. So the reason we're doing this is because of your mum, who I think, and I did know her for a year and a half or so, and I think she did show some narcissistic characteristics to some extent, but I wouldn't call her a narcissist. Mm-hmm. So the way I see it is that people have something called narcissistic personality disorder, which means that they tick certain boxes, which show that they are or can be defined as a narcissist. Now, I wouldn't say that your mum was a narcissist as such, but she had lots of narcissistic traits, I would say. For example, as you say, being very self-absorbed, being quite selfish, if I can put it in that way, that she thought about herself first, generally. Mm-hmm. She was a little bit manipulative, and narcissistic people can be very manipulative in quite a malevolent way, actually. But I wouldn't call her anything like as serious as that.
No, I don't think she was malevolent at all. I think to a degree she was a bit more vulnerable, kind of like the vulnerable narcissist.
Yes, there are different types of narcissists. Yeah. We don't want to get into too much detail here, but you can have grandiose narcissists, and those are people who think they're very self-important. There are vulnerable narcissists who display those kind of things, but actually it's to hide their fragility. Mm. You can have malignant narcissists and all sorts of, there's several other categories. But one of the things that is common, I would say, to narcissistic people is that they don't have much empathy. Mm. And although I kind of quite liked your mum, actually, and she and I got on fine.
Very well.
But she
described you as lovely.
Oh, well, that's very nice of her to do that. But she was somebody who didn't really connect with the way other people were feeling and thinking. Mm. She was very much thinking about herself. Mm. And that wasn't a particularly attractive aspect of her, really. No. Very self-absorbed. And we found out, didn't we, that she was different, as she called herself. Mm. She was different, and she had a secret that she held all her life about her being gay. Mm. And it's not surprising that she was rather self-absorbed.
Yeah, because I think that the whole shame aspect for her of which she'd been brought up to believe was that it was shameful to be gay. My grandmother talked about the dirty deeds of women.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, and my mum described it as an affliction. So she held that really painful side inside of herself, and probably it kind of corroded away in what was happening. But I'm just thinking in terms of, like, you know, it having a label. I mean, I found the term narcissistic helpful as a label, as a lens, really, to see mum through. Yeah. And it wasn't me initially that called her narcissistic. It was when I was going through therapy in my 50s that my therapist said to me, have you ever thought whether your mother might be narcissistic? And I said, no, not really. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I kind of thought that narcissism applied to men and not women, and that it wasn't something that you could. But then I've discovered ever since that there's a whole huge lot of a body of people examining whether or not you've got a narcissistic mother and the effects that can have on you. And I think that for me, as my mum got older, actually, I got to know her better. And I did something a really key thing, which is really helpful when you're dealing with somebody who's narcissistic, in my experience, which is to abandon the expectation or the hope that they're going to behave like other people who have empathy. Yeah. You've got to let go of that, because if you keep on believing that one day your mother will wake up and be able to do that, it's just not true. It's that, you know, if you lack empathy, you lack empathy, you lack empathy.
It probably goes back to childhood.
Yeah.
Very often it does, and there's been some kind of injury or lack of connection that the person who is narcissistic had when they were children. And actually it's something that's kind of inbuilt in them, and it's very hard to shift it. In fact, probably impossible in many cases. So I completely agree with you that you've got to acknowledge that they are unlikely to change. Yeah. And so you set boundaries and you decide the best way to manage them. Yeah. And I think you did that with your mum, because you worked out.
I did eventually. It's funny. It was kind of like actually accepting that my mum wasn't going to change, accepting that I wasn't going to have this ideal mum who would be able to focus on what I felt I needed as a child. As a child, even though I was in my 50s. That I had to abandon that, and that felt like a grieving process. That actually felt like to let go of that. It felt like I was letting go of this ideal mother, and then once that mist had cleared, really, then being able to see her for who she was. And there were many wonderful aspects about my mum, but empathy wasn't one of them.
No, I would say that.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that you sort of came to terms with this in your 50s is not uncommon.
No.
I think people live with this without really realising exactly what is it that's wrong with my mum or my dad or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And it's
or
only
my partner.
Exactly. Which
that's another whole issue.
And that's another whole issue which we won't go into now. But it's not surprising that some people don't really quite cotton onto all this until later in life, and it took you, I think I'm right saying, into your 50s to kind of click that this is actually probably a characteristic that your mother had and it was never going to change.
Yeah.
And it's better to understand that in your 50s than not to understand it at all and labour under a delusion for your whole life.
Yeah.
You know?
So I think the kind of grieving process was important to me, and then I could see her more clearly, and then kind of also thinking about how to manage it, and also recognising, it's not as if my mum was a bad person and I'm a good person. There's good and bad in all of us, and I think we're actually all on the narcissistic spectrum at some point or another.
Exactly.
We
are when we're babies, when we're very small. We do have a narcissistic sort of personality, because everything's about us when we're very little. Yeah. And certainly when we grow up, that we start.
We should put that on one side.
Allowing other people's experiences to affect ours, and then we develop empathy gradually as we get older, hopefully. But some people don't.
No. And that can be very often from the narcissistic wound that they had in childhood.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
okay. So that was our take on narcissism, or having a self-absorbed mum. I'd love to hear any comments that you've got about how if that's been a problem in your life, and how you found it difficult to talk about it or easier to talk about it now. So please drop me a comment below, or you can also reach me on Instagram at Helen P. Garlick, or Twitter, Helen P. Garlick. In the meantime, I'd love you to subscribe. And next week, we're going to be talking about the key topic of boundaries. Boundaries are your best friend when you're dealing with people who are narcissists or self-absorbed. So talking about boundaries and other ways that you can manage things to make it easier for yourself. So thank you so much for staying with us, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Hello, It's Better to Talk. Love and light.